Thank you, Grieve. Thank you so much. So it is with great admiration and profound respect that I introduce Professor Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, who is a thinker of extraordinary depth, whose also intellectual labor continues to reshape our understanding of violence, enduring shadows, and the fragile pathways toward repair and reconciliation. Professor Gobodo-Madikizela will deliver the closing keynote address, which is titled The Afterlife of Violent Histories, New Directions in Knowledge Production. From Stellenbosch University, where she holds the South African National Research Foundation Research Chair in Violent Histories and Transgenerational Trauma, to her directorship of the Center for the Study of the Afterlife of Violence and the Reparative Quest, she has crafted a space where the unspeakable can be articulated and the wounds of history laid bare for the possibility of healing. Her scholarship, anchored in such groundbreaking text as A Human Being Died That Night, which has been reprinted as a Marine classic, is not merely academic. It is an ethical summons, a call to confront the debris of historical atrocities with courage, to grapple with the haunting repetitions of trauma across generations, and to imagine forms of repair that transcend the logic of retribution. Professor Gobodo-Madikizela's accolade, among them the Temple Prize that she won recently, and the Ari Oppenheimer Fellowship Award, which is the highest academic honor in Africa, attest to the far-reaching resonance of her work. Yet it is her commitment to illuminating the human condition through volumes like Breaking Intergenerational Cycle of Repetition and Memory that stands as a testament to her enduring influence. Professor Gobodo-Madikizela's intellectual journey reminds us that the past is not inert. It continues to live in us, shaping the contours of the present and conditioning the futures we dare to dream. We are profoundly honored to have her with us, so please join me in welcoming Professor Gobodo-Madikizela, who is also, she also served as a professor at large here at the Africa Institute. Yes, you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emery, for that wonderful introduction. How great it is that they asked you to introduce the lecture. I feel so proud that you have been up here to reconnect with us, your former fellows at our center. So thank you very much. My deepest appreciation to Professor Salah Hassan for inviting us, for initiating that conversation that brought us all here. To Ahur Ali Hassim, thank you very much. It's been such a warm welcome that we have experienced here, and just sitting next to you made it very clear to me that the Global Studies University is a university for the people of the continent and for emerging and young scholars. So really very grateful to you all. To Grieve Chelwa, the organizer, thank you for inviting me and programming this session, and all your colleagues from Sarah to Lynn and others that I have not met. I'm really so grateful for the generous support you've given postdoc fellows who have been here for the whole week. And what a joy and privilege to be in this environment where deep scholarship is discussed, and for these emerging scholars to witness what it is to create knowledge. They will return home to Stellenbosch, to this so-called historically white institution really with their intellectual capacity blackened or Africanized, just for want of a better term of describing it. I have been truly inspired by Thandika Mkandawire, and I must mention that I'm not a scholar of Mkandawire. I am using him as a touchstone of just how we create knowledge and how fundamentally it is the creating of knowledge, new knowledge within our institution is important as African scholars. And his advocacy for transformation of African universities' role in global knowledge production, what I really find important in the way that he calls us to this idea of building knowledge is that it doesn't eschew existing knowledge. He said, let's engage with it. Let's debate with it. Let's interrogate this existing knowledge rather than to think that we can throw it out because it is already existing. Let's engage with it, and if someone says, let's poke holes in it. And so I find that very useful, and there are scholars before him who have done just that. African scholars such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, among black scholars who played a pivotal role in challenging the dominance of Western epistemology and advocating for the centrality of Southern knowledge in global discourse. By deconstructing and reappropriating Western concepts and poking holes in it, they developed new frameworks that were deeply rooted in African experience and struggle. Du Bois, for instance, in his reflections on the sorrow songs, exemplifies the power of a black scholar drawing from both personal and historical roots to create profound knowledge. By deeply engaging with the spiritual history of enslaved Africans and African Americans, Du Bois not only analyzed their musical and cultural significance, but also recognized them as a testament to the resilience and enduring spirit of his people. This personal connection, coupled with his scholarly analysis, allowed Du Bois to uncover the hidden narratives and profound emotions embedded within these songs, ultimately contributing to a deeper understanding of Black history and Black African American experience. Césaire's concept of negritude, while influenced by European literary and philosophical traditions, celebrated African identity and culture as a source of strength and resistance against colonial oppression. A way of, quote, rooting oneself and self-confirmation, confirmation of one's being, unquote, as he said. Actually, in fact, this was Senghor's quotation as well in terms of describing the importance of negritude when it was criticized by others, such as, for example, Wole Soyinka, who famously criticized the movement, suggesting that this obsessive overstating of Black pride places Black people always on the defensive, saying notably and not uncharacteristically, quote, a tiger doesn't proclaim its tigerness, it jumps at its prey, unquote. Nonetheless, these theories were very influential as a political and intellectual foundation for Black consciousness. Now, all of these scholars, you can see that their theorizing is very much rooted in personal experience, in culture, but also in personal experience. It recalls for me an important work that was done also by Frantz Fanon that we know so well. My own thinking, the development of my work, has a trajectory also of being based on personal experience, but also based on work that I did at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I began exploring these questions on the afterlife of apartheid as a way of reflecting on the trajectory from the transition periods after apartheid through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to the current generation, reflecting on what it means that we had such a successful transition in South Africa and yet finding ourselves where we are at the moment. I should emphasize at the outset that these perspectives they depart from the frameworks that have been discussed here. The connection is merely that it is about developing a new way of understanding a concept that is known in psychology as transgenerational trauma. This idea of the afterlife is not a new word, it's not an original term. Some of you may be aware that it's a term that was framed by Saidiya Hartman. So my work begins, the reframing of this idea begins not only in our center as a center that reflects on violent histories that have continued for several generations and crossing generations of violence and oppression, and looking at what are the consequences of these histories upon subsequent generations. And so the notion of the afterlife describes that. So this was my first launching of this idea of rethinking the psychological concept of transgenerational trauma using different lenses. And this was my first publication, and I then followed up with it as it is a work in progress, followed up with a major presentation at the Center for Advanced Studies at Stellenbosch University called STEERS, with a paper that I titled, "I Am Not Your White Gaze, of Blackness, Whiteness, and Being Human." And within that article reflected on my own experience of being black at Stellenbosch University. And I will not go into detail with that, but the article, that presentation led to this article that I am going to draw from today, the time of Nachtlekheid, which is a concept that is very psychoanalytic concept. This is a forthcoming presentation next month in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. This work that is transgenerational trauma is work that has been debated across disciplines, but mostly debated around the experience of the Holocaust. It centers the Holocaust as the reference point for thinking about trauma in general and thinking about the consequences of trauma across generations. I question this. I speak back to this concept of transgenerational trauma, and for my purposes, I am interested in the traumas of subjugation, the traumas of oppression over several years. And as I mentioned, my starting point is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Reflecting on these traumas and what happened at the Truth Commission, as many of you know, the commission was a site for the testimony of history of violence and trauma in South Africa, in the context of South Africa. This that you see on the screen is our first outreach, going out into the communities to tell people about what the commission was going to do. It was an invitation to communities. This was the very first community we went to. And the interesting thing is that even though we were informing people about the TRC, this already began as a testimony, as a site of testimony about trauma itself. The woman you see there, Cynthia Ngewu, her story, she passed away last week, and her story has been repeated in Google Scholar for more than 1,000 times. The story of the Gugulethu 7 is cited in Google Scholar for more than 1,000 times, and her particular individual story of forgiving, expressing, reaching out to a black person who lured her son towards their death, and her forgiving of this black man who was drawn to work for the state, is cited in Google Scholar 286 times. And no one talks about her as the origin of particular kind of knowledge. She is referenced, her story is referenced, but herself, her story, she is not used or referenced as the knowledge maker for all these citations. And yet, when we hear stories about people such as Primo Levi, for example, or Jean Amery, these are philosophers, but her story is not a story of a philosopher. It's just referenced as cited. And this, for us, is a trauma, is an example of how these individuals who came to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as you can see there, their stories have been referenced over and over again in the literature on trauma, appropriated, and the stories become a subtext, but not the actual story that is the knowledge, that they become knowledge makers. The traumas of oppression and subjugation experienced over generations by people who came to the commission are collective and multi-generational, resulting in psychic wounding that each descendant generations carries, passing it on to the next generation. This is accompanied by a sense of entrapment, with contemporary subjects being caught up in a sort of time warp involving past traumatic events. As carriers of their parents' past, the descendants' generation must cope with the unmastered psychological task that has been passed on by their parents' generation. The insights about the transgenerational dramas of violent and traumatic past are captured in Toni Morrison's seminal text, Beloved, and the text that I like to refer, and the text that for me captures most powerfully the way that I want to think about transgenerational trauma. Morrison's evocative portrayal of the return and reenactment of historical past is called the re-memory. She refers to it as a re-memory in her poems. She portrays it poignantly in these quotes. She uses Sete, her main character in the book Beloved, talks back to her community about how these traumas of enslavement return to her. And she says, someday you'll be walking down the road and you'll hear something or see something going on, so clear, and you think it's you thinking it up, but no, it's when you bump into a re-memory that belongs to somebody else. And this is trying to convey this sense of a repetition. You are bumping into a re-memory, something that belongs to someone else that doesn't belong to you. In psychoanalytic terms, this re-memory reflects an unmastered traumatic experience. It becomes, as the scholars in psychoanalysis say, a task to be pursued. The task is to return and to complete the work for the generations before. One of the most evocative scholars for me in this respect is Nicholas Abrams and Maria Torok, whose discussion of the notion of haunting past chronologically precedes scholars who have popularized the concept of ghostly hauntings, including Jacques Derrida, Avery Gordon, Stephen Frosch, and others who have taken on this notion of hauntings. I suggest in my project that the discussions of the spectacular forms of violence witnessed in contemporary South Africa, the apartheid era atrocities, are rendered invisible. In other words, we talk in South Africa about the current violence as if it is not linked to the history of apartheid violence. The indelible imprints of the violent past in the lives of individuals and communities rarely enters debates about the kind of cruel aggression we have witnessed in South Africa. This woman, for example, who testified at the TRC, saved the hair that fell from his son after he was poisoned during torture under apartheid's torture system, abducted by the apartheid security forces and imprisoned and detained, and during detention, he was imprisoned. By the time he was released, he was already at death's bed. And his mother noticed the hair that fell from him, and she kept it for more than 10 years. She kept his hair, not knowing she would one day be in front of the TRC. That is forgotten today when we talk about the violence that we see in South Africa, the link between the past and the present, the use of torture, assassination, massacres in black townships committed by young white men conscripted into apartheid's army, and other forms of state repression fall under the rubric of the aesthetics of cruelty in South Africa, for they were intended to create a spectacle of suffering, asserting the state's power while instilling fear. And not only these dramatic forms of violence matter, as the anthropologists Vina Das and Arthur Kleinman point out in the introduction to their edited volume, Remaking a World, Violence, Social Suffering, and Recovery. We should not underestimate, they say, the repercussions of the quote-unquote soft knife of apartheid policies and the major disruptions that these policies caused in the everyday lives of communities. So these perspectives are important, but they don't delve into the real depth of what the repetition is about. And what I try to do in my work and what I introduce in my work and I call the triadic temporality of trauma is a way of moving from this unidirectional understanding of transgenerational trauma from the past to the present to a much more complex and nuanced way of understanding. I, of course, draw on psychoanalysis perspective of understanding historical trauma, but expand on it. Rather than the view of this trauma as just unidirection, phase being from the past to the present, I draw up a picture of a much more complex way of understanding temporality that is not only about the past to the present, but dates back several generations. So I speak about, in my work, about the three temporalities. And I do so because I see, again, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a site for helping us to rethink these concepts, because there we witness what is the trauma. And now that we were able to look back over the 30-year period, we can reflect to think about what was that moment of the TRC. What is it that was missed at that moment of the TRC when we spoke about reconciliation and forgiveness? What is it when we think back that forces us to rethink even that transition period in order to understand what is happening today? And so my work then looks at three temporalities. One, which is the ordinary one, that from the past to the present, that looks at how the past unfolds into and continues into the transitional transmission of from the past to the present. And what's important with this is that it's again this sort of, you can look at what happened in the present and look at it in terms of what happened just in the immediate past. The second temporality that I introduce in my work is much more complex, or introduces some complexity. What is recalled about the past was not present in the conscious realm, and only emerges in awareness retrospectively. So I want to, and then let me just say also the third one the second one is a pivot of both the first and the third temporality. And the second temporality is triggered by an entanglement of present experience and memories of past experience. The third temporality, which I will describe at length, is one that dates back, recalls, or goes back several generations. It's not from just the immediate past, it's several generations past. I'm going to focus on two of these temporalities before I discuss where my work is going with these, from this triadic temporality of trauma, what I call a tri-telescopic vision of temporal space. So the second temporality, as I explained, emerges retrospectively. It is a manifestation of the past that is felt and brought to awareness by events in the present. The force of the moment may emerge from external triggers. This is the force of the moment that is based on the current generation, reflecting or responding to the current moment. But at the same time, there is a retrospective reflection on things that happened in the past that were not traumatic at the time. The force of the moment then is the experience of racism, or symbols that celebrate an oppressive past. In this moment of reawakening of consciousness, the past and present exchange places, and an earlier experience becomes inscribed with traumatic meaning. This study is based, these concepts are based on a study that we conducted at Free State University and continued when I arrived in 2016 at Stellenbosch University with students who were already in the midst of the roads must fall, fees must fall, a lot of rage and anger among the students. So my question was trying to understand, what is the rage about? How do we understand this explosion of rage among this generation? A term that best captures this phenomenon of this retrospective reflection on the past as if the past was traumatic when it wasn't at the time, is a psychoanalytic concept that is that word, the Nachtraglichkeit, which is a very much psychoanalytic term. Freud coined this term to suggest an inherent forgetting of an experience that is recognized only later as a traumatic encounter. As he explained it, it is a case of a present encounter triggering a memory that is evoked and made possible by a different understanding of what is happening currently. By inscribing itself into the present, the memory is dynamically interwoven with other past and present experiences. It is thus reconstructed with such an emotional force that it transforms the past into an overwhelming experience with its helplessness and disempowering impact. A striking example is from one that I like to use from our interviews, from a student who is facing the institutional culture of racism at previously white universities. I'm a veteran of these universities. I was at UCT, I was at Free State, and now I'm at Stellenbosch. The pattern is the same. These culture of racism evoke these kinds of memory of a past that was not traumatic, but now is remembered, quote unquote, as if it were traumatic. The example is from some black students who have described how their proximity to the privilege of their white peers heightened their awareness of the deep inequality between them and their white peers, and how even the physical environment, the buildings and the surrounding streets, awaken a consciousness about the cruelty of apartheid's inequality with a force of emotions that becomes imbued with traumatic meaning. Some of these students attended previously white schools that were known as Model C schools after the end of apartheid legislation. There they formed close relationships with white children and even visited their homes for sleepovers. Now, however, reconstructing the traces of these memories and forced to confront the one-sidedness of these relationships, for the white children never went to their homes. They never visited the black residential areas. These memories stir up emotions that are assigned meanings that retrospectively evoke a shameful past that could not be faced at the time and was instead silenced. One of the students participating in a research initiative that I led at the University of Free State and published in a paper, Race and Identity, a journal, expressed it thus, quote, "I can't believe I've been friends with these people," her white peers, "for 18 years. 18 years. How could I have been blind to that humiliation, the niceness of their parents to keep the fact of the cruelty of all this past of apartheid out of view and to keep us in this position of inferiority? All these black kids going for sleepovers to white homes, never the other way around," unquote. For the black students, as young teenagers at the time, the experience of their assimilation into the dominant world, cultural world, as trauma, the impression of it being trauma had to be suspended psychically, lest it awakened the sleeping dogs of shame. The shame of being considered an other who, according to the rules of the racial pecking order, is inferior. There is something overwhelming about the underlying feeling of shame in this experience of being in two worlds at the same time, denying the feeling of dissonance in oneself to maintain the state of two-ness of one's subjectivity. It is experienced as something akin to the painful sense of bewilderment and the quote-unquote wrenching of the soul that Du Bois wrote about in The Souls of Black Folk, to describe the painful ambiguities of a double consciousness. What is suggested by Du Bois is that it is as if the person is discovering or has gained a new knowledge, both by Du Bois's idea of double consciousness and this concept of nachtraglichkeit, is that it's as if the person is gaining new knowledge. They're seeing this as if for the first time concerning their relationship to whiteness. As Du Bois has suggested, it unleashes a rage. The rage and revolt is unleashed at a later time, not at the moment that the shame is playing out, because it has to be silenced. Now, it is also possible that the emergence of a new consciousness now about the past provokes anxieties and confusions, and the rage then functions both as a defense against these overwhelming feelings and an attempt to work through the past. In other words, the confusion is like, there's a sense in which one knows that one was complicit in allowing oneself to be drawn this way, into allowing the sense of inferiority to play out in the way that it was playing out, but to silence it. So there's an awareness, at the same time there's an anxiety because of the shamefulness of the sense of awareness. This unsettling temporality of an experience from an earlier political time viewed from a different perspective in the present must be seen as a condition that plagues the born-free generation. For an opportunity to partake of the white world has not bestowed the feeling of freedom that it seemed to promise. This temporal duality of movement that projects meaning at once from the present to the past and from the past to the present illuminates this idea of this two-ness, this sense of going back to reflect on a moment that was silence, but now is shameful with all its anxieties. Fanon's psychoanalytic analysis of his observation of what he terms psychic alienation of the colonized subjects comes to mind here. The negative self-perceptions occasioned by the phenomenon of the veil and this double consciousness leads the black born-frees to question not only their identity and humanity, but also leads to problems of black self-denigration. And now this moment of the present is an awareness of just how one has participated, albeit unconsciously or perhaps subconsciously, there is an awareness nonetheless that one participated, was complicit in this. Now that is this second temporality that I think should complete this idea of what we mean by this transgenerational play of the past in the present. The third temporality that I want to describe, I want to relate this to this idea of thinking about a more embodied form of scholarship and drawing from both Toni Morrison's idea of how she uses that story in the book as a way of both talking about the continuities between the trauma of enslavement and the present, but at the same time, using the body as the site of this trauma. I draw from that, and I draw as well from the stories of the TRC in the way that victims of trauma testified and told their stories. And so for me, this third temporality invites us to go beyond textual representation. The testimony and talking about trauma, that when we speak about the narrative of trauma, the importance of narrative as a way of working through trauma, we are not only relating to words, to textual narratives, but we're thinking also about a range of other experiences as we witness at the TRC. The cultural context in terms of the music that was sung at the TRC. There was the embodiment of the trauma in the way that people told the stories of trauma at the TRC in such dramatic ways. I found useful insights from the work of Rebecca Schneider for thinking about the aesthetics of memory in trauma, in thinking about this third temporality, thinking about the aesthetics of memory in trauma testimonies. In her study of performance, Schneider explores movement and the gestural and as a body-to-body transmittance of affect and memory. This idea of how the affect, even from the stories of people who are traumatized, how this is conveyed to the audience, how people are not just telling the story to the audience, for the audience to listen, how they convey their trauma through the body, the expression of the burden of the trauma on their bodies is this giving, sharing of the affective aspects of the memory of the trauma, which reverberates beyond the testimony itself. And as Schneider said, it reverberates beyond the performance itself. And here I apply that insight as an insight that can be used for us to understand how these testimonies have this resonance in the room that people are affected. You cannot not be affected by it. There is a strong resonance here as well with the notion of transgenerational continuity and how through testimony the body becomes the link between memory and place in the way that Toni Morrison writes her book and is portrayed so powerfully in her depiction of the notion of rememory in her book. So in this third temporality, drawing from this site of the truth, the place of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I draw especially from the testimony of one person for the purposes of this discussion. There were several voices at the TRC where, in the midst of testifying, victims would scream their testimony into the audience. It was a very powerful way where people, in the midst of testifying, they would suddenly scream out their pain. The testimony of Nomonde Chalata is one such testimony. At the opening of the TRC, it serves to illustrate this idea. I consider Nomonde, we see these figures in history, I consider these figures that play an important role in helping us to theorize or to go beyond what is performed or what is said, to thinking theoretically about what are we witnessing, what are they bringing us into our world of scholarship. So I consider her to be an important figure of our political time, and therefore an important site for us to think through what these testimony can tell us about transgenerational transmission of trauma. Her cry at the TRC can be interpreted, or rather reinterpreted, as I do in this work, as a sign foreshadowing an impending doom of violence to come, representing the collective lament of communities of survivors crying out for the unmourned remains of loved ones, many of which are still hidden in the secret graves of apartheid's death farms. Just 2 days ago, one such woman who spent more than 30 years since 1990 looking for the remains of, she came to the commission and continued to look for the remains through the courts, through the offices of the ANC, the remains of a daughter who was abducted and tortured, Mrs. Unistina Simelani. She died 2 days ago without having been able to identify the body of her daughter. So, as an interruption into this trajectory of transition and transformation in our country, Nomonde Chalata's cry signaled a staging of a future in which the chaos of violence of the past do not cease, pointing not to a closure or healing, but rather to a question screamed into the future: when will it end? The Truth and Reconciliation, it was hoped, would put the past behind and be in the past, and the present would be a stepping stone towards reaching the horizon of a future of new imaginaries. But this hoped-for temporal structure has failed the older generation as well as the born-free generation, and the arc of the future has bent towards the past of Chalata's generation, where the violence that screamed itself through her body has become the current generation's present. There's a catalogue of several repetitions of the past in South Africa's contemporary history, or rather, more accurately, the recent events in our country. Miners shot by black police in large numbers, evoking the memory of Sharpeville when the miners were shot down in 34 people were killed. Labor strikes, life esidimeni, people dying under the care of the health department under circumstances that are unspeakable. There are people who have been shot just involved in peaceful marches. It's a repetition, it's a catalogue of repetition of apartheid's history. The color of the doers of the deeds may have changed, but the culture and practice remains the same. The gloomy and tragic reality of this cycle of repetition of the past has played out in my country in this way that we can only understand it as a repetition, not in the face of race, but rather in the repetition of a culture that has just been taken over. It is not a haunting of crypts that are nameless, but we can name it. We know what is being repeated. We've seen it in our campuses at our universities, especially at Stellenbosch University. And this brings me to the idea of moving from focusing on descendants of victims to thinking about the descendants of perpetrators themselves. How do we understand this notion of the transgenerational transmission of the past in the way that we understand the resurgence of racism in our institutions, the explosion of racism, which we have seen at Stellenbosch University and other campuses. This is an image. I wanted to begin this reflection with a very brief look at how Ken Gonzalez Day is an African American, how he puts up throughout the country these exhibitions, installations of what he calls the erased lynchings. I find this so useful because what it does, this is a famous or infamous photograph that one can see of a lynching that happened in the 1930s. It's a very well-known lynching. In fact, this was from one of the cards of lynching that was popular at the time, where white Americans would take photographs of themselves during a lynching and send each other greetings. And what Ken Gonzalez Day does, he removes the bodies of the victims hanging on the trees. And he wants us to focus on who are these people, who are the perpetrators. And you can think some of these people, some of the photographs are with children. They are well dressed and they are coming to witness a lynching. And Ken Gonzalez wants us to zoom in on who these people are, not on the victims, but on who these people are. And we can think then, who are their children? This is from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Again, it's an image that shows a perpetrator demonstrating a torture method that was called the wet bag method. Again, it invites us to think about who are these people. And indeed, at the Truth Commission, the person who brought the friend who is now seemingly is performing the role of victim, he asked this man, what kind of man are you who would do this to people, to choke them with the wet bag method to a point of almost losing their breath to death? And this man said, I am asking myself the same question, what kind of a man am I? And it raises the question of how do these trajectories of violence unfold to bring these people to the point where they become these violent, heartless men? And what is it that they teach? What is inherited from from their history into how is that passed on? The answer, we may not have answers, of course, and one answer that I want to venture here is that in South Africa, white South Africans have not fully acknowledged being beneficiaries of white apartheid privilege. There's been a lot of denial. Even F.W. de Klerk himself, this is an image of F.W. de Klerk. After his death, he made a posthumous apology. Can you believe that? He's recording himself apologizing for apartheid. But he says, play the recording after my death. What kind of an apology is that? And even when the apology was recorded and played out in the country, there was not major news. It was like 1 week. There wasn't like an opening of a major debate about what does it mean that the last president of apartheid is acknowledging that apartheid was a crime against humanity. Mind you, he spent most of his time at the Truth Commission and outside the commission denying that apartheid was a crime against humanity. And so my argument is that within that kind of atmosphere, when there hasn't been a proper acknowledgement of the past, it is easy for the younger generation of many white students not to understand this culpability, the sense of responsibility. And what happens in their homes is instead a justification of the past, and it's easier for them then to want to replay that past because they understand the superiority, the white supremacist idea of what it means to be white. And for those of them who are repeating the racism, they are at a loss. They don't know how to define themselves except in the way that their parents perpetuate, which is the supremacist of defining who they are. Now, as I conclude in the last 2 minutes that I have, I want to touch on where my work is going now. So I have sketched out my work from the 3 pieces of work that I have shared with you. And what I want to do now, I want to work on what I call the transnational dialogue of these histories of violence. And to do that, I draw from a scream that is defined by Frederick Douglass in his book, which is a narrative that he tells in his book about his Aunt Hester and how the memory of Aunt Hester's scream as she was beaten by the slave owner remained with him many years after he was free, he was a free man. And the importance of this description by Frederick Douglass depicting the violence of the whip and all the dramas that are associated with the whipping of his aunt is very similar for me, or rather I bring this into dialogue with the way that the screams that we had at the TRC, the dramatic ways in which the trauma and violence and suffering that was described can be compared with those screams, with the way that Frederick Douglass depicts these experiences of his aunt. In his narrative, in his book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, this serves as a crucial witness to trauma in the similar way that the TRC testimonies are a witness to trauma. And by bringing them into dialogue with each other, the screams at the TRC and the scream from this period of enslavement, I want to demonstrate that these defining sounds of trauma then and now, and juxtaposing these narratives from the 2 continents, and as well as other continents in the South where violence was experienced over several generations. These are more than screams. They are the expressions of pains and physical manifestations of these histories of violence and highlight the embodied trauma. The screams seen as a release of accumulated pain across these continents. And as Frederick Douglass says, he has been awakened in the early hours of morning, remembering the scream of his aunt. We too remember these screams and are constantly facing the memory in these embodied forms of these past, of the people who experienced them, and connecting them as collective experiences of Black people who had suffered these traumas in the past and continue to suffer these experiences. These then become moments of witnessing which are crucial for acknowledging and validating the fact that these traumas cannot be separated. They are collective they cannot be treated as individual traumas, but there is an arc that connects them across temporalities and across continents. They encapsulate the profound, enduring traumas of all of these colonial experiences, and their visceral experiences transcend individual experiences into a collective suffering by the communities. Now, I see Emery is coming here to remind me that this is the end. I just want to say one sentence, and that sentence is captured in the subsequent slides that I have here, which are slides from the arts, which is a different kind of aesthetic. We have been speaking here about the aesthetic of cruelty and how this aesthetic of cruelty can be used as a site for understanding the transgenerationality in this notion of the triadic temporality rather than this transgenerational trauma that is spoken about by scholars such as Marian Hirsch and others who speak about the prosthetic memory and so on. This is the triadic temporality of trauma. But from that understanding of the aesthetics of cruelty, there is a new way of understanding, not new, but it's actually a tradition among people who have been oppressed, a tradition of drawing from the arts, whether it is the culture or culture of music, cultural way of presenting music as healing, or the arts, visual arts itself. This one captures for me most powerfully what it means, what this means, what this idea of returning to the aesthetics of the arts by a woman who uses the story of her mother, who has been a maid throughout her life, and uses the dresses of the maid, transforms them into something beautiful as a way of working through that trauma of living through 3 generations of a great-grandmother, her grandmother, and her mother who were working as domestic workers through heavy labor, and how now she transforms this memory into this site of beauty and tells the story of appropriating these outfits and making them into something beautiful. And my end point really is to suggest that the arts does offer us that reparative possibility, and this does that as this does. This is a dress that is called the Blue Dress, and it was an artwork that was, you can come up, Emery. It was an artwork that was designed during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearing by a white woman who was reflecting on the traumatic story of a woman who was abducted, tortured, and shot and buried in a secret grave, and her body was found years later, dressed in covering her pelvic area with a blue plastic bag. And that story is complicated, but what this artist takes from that is the story of the blue plastic bag and this woman whose body was buried in secret grave, found later in life. She makes this dress and tells the story of beauty. As you can see, I love the elegance with which this body in motion through this empty dress, but you can see that it is in motion, and the tragic threat behind her, of this wolf behind her, and yet there is this elegance of a moving forward in a kind of a hopeful moment that is more agentic than the suffering that she had. And these are stories that I would like to end with as a way of gesturing towards the idea, not so much of repair, but of the reparative quest, the quest for repair in the aftermath of these tragic incidents. Thank you very much, Emery.
Thank you so much, Prof. Pumla. So that was really just wonderful. I'm not going to make comments, so I am going to open to the floor. Okay, so if we can have 3 questions, and then because we run really out of time.
Am I guilty of overstepping the time?
You did not, and it's an amazing presentation that definitely will resonate with us
Really wonderful.
for a long time here in Sharjah. The 3 of us here as art historians are very pleased that you ended with those visual images that speak to trauma and that history of violence and so forth. And by the way, Mary Sibanda was in the last biennial at Hur, and it's the same installation that was actually, it's a different one, but it's similar to the work, and it was at Al Hamriya Studios there. It was a brilliant thing. Being interested in the visual, let me just, there is one question that I just wanted to ask. I mean, it's just, if you can go back to the image of no, the one before with the posthumous, yeah. There are 2 intriguing things in this painting, just reading it visually. In the back, there's a picture of a South African black woman who most likely a maid. And I think I'm suspecting is by Ermestine or some of the white painters of South Africa. But the picture of him and his wife, and it speaks volume to that interesting history. But it was also intriguing to me, and that is, I don't expect you to answer it immediately, is to look at that choice of painting by somebody who was one of the architects of apartheid for a while. So that is one issue. The other issue, 2 issues that are actually interrelated. I'm always in the study of this trauma, I have doubt about the Holocaust, although it's a subject of a lot of studies that are very useful and I wouldn't dismiss them. But there's something of an exceptionalism about it as a source of the kind of a major studies of trauma, because it tends to hide the fact that of how the uses of the Holocaust today as a marker of an exceptional violence that has never happened in history. Black people are always asking about the transatlantic and the number of people and the deaths, which is estimated really higher than what happened. It doesn't mean that there is one violence or the number or quantity justified that. So it was just one area that I thought is interesting, because the traumatized population or those who experience the transgeneration are actually doing the same to another set of people. As Said said it, the possibility of Israel is based on the displacement of other people who are now experiencing. So that is one. So that exceptionalism, if you can comment on it. There is one point that just give me a second to remember it, which is that the role of ordinary people, or the so-called little Eichmann, that do the job in a bureaucratic way. The person you gave an example of with the sack over the head of the black victim is not at the ordinary level. I'm talking about those people who thought of it as a job to do. And those were really highlighted in 2 examples of movies. One is called The Reader. I think we talked about it before. There was a film is called about the reader or something like that. I forgot it. The Reader. The Reader, and it's fictional.
The Reader.
The Reader, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And the second one was a documentary about a Jewish judge who presided over trials not at the Nuremberg level, but of the ordinary type of people who were recruited as policemen and women in the absence of enough forces to do the job at that level. And several of them, the judge at the end was sympathetic and curious about a specific character who insisted until the end not to deny his involvement. Everyone was denied the involvement in the direct decision whom to kill that day or that day as they are ordered to do. And he asked a very interesting question in response to critique by American journalists. How come you're so sympathetic to this character, or at least curious until the end, even though the person who committed all these crimes? His answer was simple. He said, have you as Americans asked yourself about the pilot who dropped the bomb over Hiroshima and Nagasaki? What do you think of that person? So I just leave it at this, and I hope, it's just for comment. They were not really a sort of question, but I would love your reflections on it.
Yeah, everything you've said has been at the center of, in different times of my thinking about this. First, to start with where you began with the image of the apologizing, quote unquote, FW, the questions you raised. I gave a talk at a cultural studies conference in Amsterdam last June, shortly after this thing, and spoke a little bit, reflected on the question. I still have not found who the artist is. I'm still looking for it, but it's in that genre of artists who draw Black people in a much more, there are these sort of paintings that draw people in, with bare breast and, that kind of there's a much more, for want of a better way of describing it, respectful way, but still, it's Emma Stein kind of, as you say, painting. There are others, but I still have not found out what it is. And it was very curious, you're absolutely right. Almost as if that I'm presenting an image of Blackness that is respectful. And it's a contradiction in a way, because as you point out, it's a subservient role at the same time. And in a way, it doesn't redeem him. It's almost as if he's putting it there to be redeemed, to redeem himself, but it doesn't, because the apology is a non-apology. So I would love to talk to you further about that, but really very important point you're making. The Holocaust has been very much at the center of the domination of our thinking about the crimes of the 20th and even 21st century. I mean, it's still today, with what's happening in Gaza, it's still hoisted and held up as the ultimate crime that must be prevented at all costs, and which means whatever happens to others, as long as we are centering the Holocaust as the reason that, it's this protectionist kind of idea. And that is actually, some of the scholars have recognized that the scholarly community is as much accountable for that discourse as the words of the destruction of people in Palestine, for example, is happening, because it draws a lot from the how the truth was made to be the truth of everything that has to do with the crimes of our recent centuries, in the way that scholars spoke and wrote about it. And so it's time for a change of gears as far as scholarship is concerned, so that there is a new, Palestine might become our new subtext, that, shifting away from the Holocaust being the subtext of our scholarship about trauma, to Palestine being the subtext of art, so that so that it becomes possible to theorize about what is happening there. And I think that even the terms that exist don't really explain for us what is going on. To call it a genocide, in my view, doesn't really get to the point of what exactly is going on here. And as scholars, I think we have to interrogate even those terms that are, like racism, genocide. We have to think about what happens when individuals, as you point out, like this one, engage in these kinds of crimes. We know, for instance, there are soldiers who have dissented, who are speaking about the crimes they committed and are burdened by what they did. We know of men in Vietnam who, in fact, are the reason we now speak about post-traumatic stress disorder, because they returned from Vietnam. They were no longer heroes, and they were having nightmares about killing innocent people. And so that is something to think about, even about today, when young people are acting out these stories of the same similar kind of violence. It may not be killing and murder, but it is violence nonetheless. And I think that these terms, when something happens at our university, a white student, for example, this is a true story, goes to the room of a black student and urinates on his computer and books on his desk. And when he's confronted by the student who asks him, "Why are you doing this?" and he says, "This is what we do to black boys." What is that about? It's not the shooting, it's not the torture, it is a violence. And the question of what is going on, I think, requires us to not be satisfied with simply naming this racism, but rather to ask new questions or to delve deeper to understand who are these people and why is it that it becomes so easy to commit these kinds of crimes. So I think unless, or at least as a first step, we recognize the crime, as a crime, not as a moment of glorification of suffering, but as something that is a crime, so that the idea of never again becomes never again, but not an idea of only for us, only one can live with this idea of never again. So it's a challenge to us scholars. All of these questions that you raise, I hope we have an opportunity through the Global Studies University to pursue these questions, to really get into understanding what is going on, because what we have as answers, I don't think allows us to actually develop a sense of understanding of who are these people, who are their children, how is it that their children perpetuate a redefined kind of violence, not in the physical form that their parents' generation performed, but redefined nonetheless. I think that's where we need to clarify these questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Pumla. So I think we can continue the conversation, over dinner. So thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you
Pumla,
very
for
much,
gracing us
everyone.
with-
Thank you, Salah. Thank you, Hur. And Sarah, Lim. Thank you, everyone.